Hey guys, hope you're having a great day. I'm Colin from the Mountain View Hardware Club, and today we'll be giving a detailed overview of the Inwin 303 in the black and blue color scheme. At $89.99, this case goes head to head with other popular cases in this price bracket, like the Phanteks Senthi Pro and Pro M, and the Fractal Define S, which all cater towards water cooling. Let's take a look. The shipping box is your basic cardboard, and inside you find the accessory bag and the case itself. The case comes protected on all corners by hard styrofoam and should endure most shipping damages, but I do wish a little more is included for the possibility of shipping a full system. Ours made in immaculate condition, however, and another nice touch is the woven sleeve for the case that protects the tempered glass and steel outer panels from damage during transport. Along with the case, the box also contains an accessory bag, and I love how it is a Ziploc bag because it's of course reusable. However, the bags that the actual accessories are in are your standard sealed plastic bags, which you have to attack with scissors or force to open. Inside you get the multilingual manual, 10 zip ties, which I wish were Velcro straps instead, a bag containing 11 motherboard standoffs with 15 hex head screws for anchoring the motherboard, and a Phillips head socket for screwing in the standoffs. You get a bag with 24 screws for 2.5-inch drives, and also a bag with 10 screws for 3.5-inch drives, more than needed, which is of course welcomed. You also get a bag of 32 fan screws, 12 water cooling washers for mounting radiators, and finally a bag with a graphics card bracket and mounting accessories. The unique layout of the case allows for a solid front and top to create a very clean aesthetic. Almost all of the chassis, including all of the outer panels, save for the glass window, are made of pressed steel. All but the side panels are also riveted in, and give the case its impressive strength and rigidity without an inner frame. It measures in at 215mm wide, fairly narrow for a mid-tower nowadays, 500mm tall, without the feet is more like 480mm, and 480mm in depth. The height and narrowness of this case creates a very slender profile. That front I/O was composed of two USB 3.0 ports, a microphone and headphone jack, two USB 2.0 ports, and the Inwin logo itself. All of these are backlit by a white LED covered by a blue plastic sheet and is SATA powered. This blue illumination is the sole blue accent of the case, everything else here is black. You of course get a power and reset button, which don't have as much travel as I would like. The side panels of this case are beautiful, so let's take a look at them. You get two, both 460mm in both axes, one of them steel with ventilation and the other tempered glass. Both of these attach to the frame in a truly ingenious way. They have slots in the bottom which line up with slots in the frame, and you can drop the panel in and swivel it to attach to the case from the top. Taking a look at the steel panel, which goes on behind the motherboard tray, it is very solid with little flex thanks to its steel construction. It doesn't improve structural rigidity a lot, nor does it really need to because the case is already so strong, but it still definitely helps. It has a stamped hexagon pattern to allow for ventilation, in this case an outtake for a radiator up top, and is deep enough to allow for decent airflow. This panel attaches via two knurled thumb screws in the top with a groove to allow for a flathead screwdriver to tighten it down more. These are sort of a captive thumb screw design, where the screws don't have to be unscrewed completely to take off the panel. You still can unscrew these all the way, and you can see that the actual panel is threaded, which catches the screws before they come out. Very neat. I also like how foam lines the places where the panel contacts the frame to reduce noise and dampen vibrations. Now let's take a look at the beautiful and unique tempered glass panel. You get plastic ridges on the top and bottom which are anchored onto the glass with some adhesive. They do stick a little out from the profile of the case, but it is a very small price to pay and isn't really perceptible at all. The glass itself is a smoked 3mm thick panel, which makes the side panel very rigid and stiff. It attaches to the top with a very creative push button mechanism, which opens the latch inside to unhook the panel. The button is very stiff, and this is appreciated because it won't pop off during transport. Another nice touch is the wide foot design, which creates sort of a floating effect and looks as much an art piece as a functional part of the case. The feet are made of plastic, but still seem strong enough for most use cases, and each foot has two soft foam pads to prevent scratching the surface it is on. The feet can be removed. To access the screws, you need to turn the case on an axis where you can reach the bottom of the feet, like on its side, and first remove the rubber blocks that prevent scratching the surface the case is on. I like how these are friction fit and are not held in by adhesive, which makes it easy to pop in and out. Once those are out, simply unscrew the screws that were hidden and the foot will pop out. An all pretty easy system, and I'm glad they weren't riveted in. And they also act as a guide for the bottom dust filter. Speaking of the dust filter, I like how it spans the whole fan array in the bottom of the case and conveniently slides out from the side and side of the back like in many cases. It uses the fetus guides and 2 notches in the bottom of the case to lock it into place. It is fairly dense, unfortunately not as dense as my Define S, but should still catch much of the larger dust particles, and the plastic webbing does not obstruct airflow that much. At the back of the case, we can see 7 expansion ports, which are all ventilated, a 120mm fan mount and grill, an I/O cutout, and a cutout for an ATX power supply, which is mounted sideways. Something to note is that the power supply mounting holes are arranged in such a way that most power supplies will have to draw air in through the inside of the case and any radiator in its way instead of through the side panel. I think Inwin should have made it so a power supply could be mounted either way, and no cutouts for water cooling, but then again, in a case this friendly for water cooling, you don't need it. That's pretty much the outside, so let's take a look inside. Once inside, you can immediately see the very unique layout that Inwin is going with for this case. The 303 pulls air through triple 120mm fans in the bottom, and the radiator mount and PSU shelf faces inside the case and expels air through the hexagonal vent in the side panel. There is of course that 120mm fan mount in the rear, which is really limited to a 120mm size fan or radiator that is 120mm wide, so most AIOs and many slim radiators will work, but be sure to do your research on the particular model you're using. Anything wider will conflict with the I/O shield mount, which is in itself very interesting as I/O shields don't really click into place, they just sort of slide in, and once inside have a significant amount of room to slide up and down. You can also see the ventilated PCIe slots secured by screws, which is better than punch out. Would have liked thumb screws, but hey, it doesn't matter, and this is a cost saving measure that doesn't really impact your experience with the case. The interior is very spacious, and you get 312.5mm of clearance between the bottom of the interior to the radiator and PSU shelf for mounting reservoirs or reservoir pump combos. Something to note though is that there is no pump or reservoir bracket included, and the slots you see are for the GPU bracket, so if you want to mount a radiator or a pump, you're going to have to mod this case. Cutout for CPU coolers is huge, measuring at 147mm wide and 158.75mm tall. You get 174mm of clearance between the motherboard tray and the tempered glass, so accounting for the standoffs, which are about 7mm tall, and a typical motherboard of around 1.5mm thick, you get around 165.5mm of clearance for a CPU cooler, a bit more than the 160mm standard specified in the manual, but I wouldn't really go past 160mm if possible. 4 standoffs are pre-mounted, universal for ITX to ATX motherboard sizes, which is awesome. Here come the things I don't really like. There is a complete lack of conventional cutouts to the right of the motherboard to allow for the routing of cables like the 24-pin, USB 3.0, SATA data, and so forth. There is a reason for this, which is that the rear hard drive mounts would conflict with them, but still I feel this is an overlook in design, and the drive mounts should have been moved to allow for cutouts. I do really like the spacious cutouts below the CPU cooler cutout, one for mini ITX and one for micro ATX. Keep in mind you cannot use one for ATX motherboards as it covers them both up, and have to use a cutout a few inches to the right of the motherboard, which will expose cables if they are unsheathed like the front I/O cables, but this is purely just an aesthetics gripe. Looking at the bottom of the case, we can see a stamped out hexagon grill with mounting holes for 3 120mm fans. The hexagons are spaced out, and they should not obstruct airflow that much. Fan mounting holes are also slightly elliptical, so you get a little wiggle room for fan placement, but not nearly as much as if they had gone for slots, which they actually do for the top radiator mount. The manual and on their website, it doesn't look like Inwin indicates bottom radiator support, but if you are running a micro ATX board or a mini ITX board, you should have plenty of room for a radiator. There is an additional set of fan holes at either end on the bottom, which I'm guessing are really meant for radiators as the spacing doesn't really line up with the other fan holes. Unfortunately, the case feet obstruct access to these holes, so you'll need to take out the case feet every time you want to screw or unscrew a radiator there. If you are running an ATX motherboard, you should have around 20 to 23 millimeters of space between the motherboard and the edge of a fan or 120 millimeter wide radiator, which is still enough to plug in the front I/O and fans and mount a radiator, although it'd probably be a struggle to plug in any bottom connectors with a radiator already installed. I would suggest a narrow radiator again, like an EKSC 360mm, which is just 120mm wide to ensure you get enough clearance. Moving on, let's check out the ingenious graphics card bracket. These are for supporting GPUs in the system. Thanks to the 303's open layout, you can cram GPUs pretty much up to around 450mm in here, but GPUs longer than roughly 350mm will block access to the SSDs, and an SSD taller than 7mm could interfere with the GPU. The bracket itself is just a thin piece of steel and a little plastic protective sticker on top to avoid scratching the cooling shroud, but seems strong enough to support pretty much all graphics cards. It can screw into 4 sets of slots on the motherboard tray, 2 sets of 2 vertical slots. This is very creative, and I love the slot design, which is universal compatibility as long as your graphics card is of course long enough to reach one, and allows you to fine-tune the fit to be perfect. Only one GPU's bracket is included, but I could definitely see you being able to buy another one for SLI or Crossfire setups. One thing to note is that you have to remove the hard drive mount behind the motherboard tray anytime you want to screw the bracket in or to loosen it to move it. Also near the front, you can see the 2.5-inch drive mounts. These are steel sleds that have the Inwin logo stamped into it and have the mounting holes raised up. These are secured into the case by a little tab like the fractal defined S, and then are tightened in from the opposite side with captive thumb screws. That is a Phillips head as well. Very nice. 2 sleds are included, and they face opposing sides, so they share the same cutout for cables. A third unpopulated sled mount is included above the GPU bracket slots, with a large cutout for cable management that I mentioned earlier. At the top, you can see the very unique showpiece mount for a radiator, which allows the radiator and fans to mount horizontally and be shown off. There's a hexagonal grille that allows for plenty of airflow, and slots to allow for more flexibility and freedom when mounting radiators. I'm in love with how this looks. It is just so unique and just looks really cool. The airflow from the radiator is then of course expelled through the side panel. You cannot mount the radiator inside the shelf due to space conflicts with the PSU out of the box. You have 95mm of space between the radiator mount and the glass, but I would highly recommend having at least 10mm of space for the fans pushing air through the radiator, as the only air they're getting is coming from the bottom of the case, so slim, medium, or even some thicker 60mm radiators should work fine with 25mm fans. Alright, let's take a look at the rear of the motherboard tray. Up top is the PSU shelf and cutouts surrounding the PSU cables. I do wish the cutout was bigger, but then again you probably will not be routing more than a 24-pin CPU power and fan cables through there. There is also a smaller cutout to allow cables to be routed behind the motherboard tray, as the PSU shelf extends the full width of the space behind the motherboard tray, and I definitely wish this was wider. The max PSU length is 200mm long, but I'm guessing you could fit up to 220mm, but this is going to be a tight squeeze. Anything longer and you'll cover up the cutouts. You also get the rest of the cavernous shelf to hide PSU cables if you are running extensions or a non-modular PSU. Moving down, we can find 2 3.5mm drive sleds that also support 2.5-inch drives, all with raised mounting points. These again mount with the tab and captive thumb screw design and are Phillips headed, and they work fine. You get plenty of room for cable management here too, with 35mm of clearance from panel to motherboard tray. Alright, so now it is pretty much time to wrap things up and form a conclusion. The Inwin 303 is truly an art piece. It looks beautiful, and the tempered glass side panel and full steel construction makes it an extremely solid offering, both literally and figuratively. It just exudes luxury, and I love it. I really like the totally new and revitalized interior layout, which puts a large emphasis on water cooling, which I think this case is really meant for. So let's talk about the pros and cons of this case. I love how sturdy the case is, the unique and creative flexible radiator mount at the top, the side removable dust filter at the bottom, the beautiful tempered glass panel and solid steel panels, the unique foot design, the awesome GPU bracket, the rich I/O options at the front, and all of the drive sleds, especially the 2.5-inch ones that show off in the front. I also love the open layout, allowing for pretty much any GPU on the market to be placed in here. The case is not without faults though, and I'm not a fan of the weird cutout positioning for routing cables, the rear drive sleds blocking the GPU bracket, and the weird cable tie holes. However, those are small quibbles. I personally own a fractal defined S, and I think for around the same price, the Inwin 303 is a great alternative. I think this case and its unique attributes are almost unrivaled in this price bracket, and anyone who is looking at a water cooling friendly case at this price point and is willing to do a little modifying to mount a reservoir and pump should look into this for sure. For $89.99, the Inwin 303 is one of the smartest buys right now.